industrial properties, different from multifamily specifically, is industrial buildings are very, very keen, or very, it's very important to be paying attention to the leases. Like multifamily, you don't really care about the leases. Like, yeah, you're going to ask, like, is everyone on month to month or is everyone on annual leases? Like, like a quick question, but like, you don't really care about what the leases look like. With industrial properties, leases are key because technically what you're buying is you're buying a bunch of leases. That's what I'm buying because these are promissory notes essentially saying that I'm going to pay you a certain amount of money for X amount of years, as well as I'm also going to pay you or not pay you for all the utilities, common area maintenance, taxes, insurances, and everything else. I'm buying promissory notes, essentially. That's what leases are, right? It really matters what those leases look like. Let me give you an example. Let's just take let's just take this this industrial property I was talking to this guy, okay? It was 24,000 square feet, but I'll say 20,000 just for quick numbers. 20,000 square feet, industrial building, warehouse, okay? So that means, it's got a couple drive-in, loading docks, most of it's warehouse, 20-foot ceilings, not a lot, maybe 2,000 square feet of office, but we'll talk about all that in a minute. I just want to talk about leases for a second. Let's just say the whole building, I'm going to give you 3 examples, okay? Think about how crazy, because they could all be different. 20,000 square foot building. All of them are generating $200,000 a year in income, okay? 3 buildings, all $200,000 a year in income, all 20,000 square feet, all the same exact layout. Watch what's interesting about this, ready? Building number 1 is one single owner-occupant tenant. That's who you're speaking to. It's an occupant of the building, one single tenant. They're paying $200,000 a year on the building right now. They want to sell the building. There's an owner-occupant. They want to sell the building. They want to sell the building and they want to leave, okay? But they're paying $200,000 a year right now. Building number 2 is a single tenant, same exact situation, but it's just a tenant, not the owner-occupant, okay? This single tenant pays $200,000 a year. They have a lease right now that is a triple net lease. Triple net lease, which means they pay all the expenses, taxes, the insurance, common area maintenance, any issues that come up with the property. So they're paying $200,000 a year, triple net. Then you have the third building. It has 10 different tenants, all renting about 2,000 square feet. They're all on gross leases. They only pay a flat rate. Okay, call $20,000 a year, 10 tenants, $20,000 a year, gross. So that means that the owner of the building, or that might be us, right, to buy it, pays all the expenses. So $200,000 a year gross. It's all $200,000 a year, but they're all valued very differently. The building that's owner occupied, where you're going to be now buying a vacant building, that might be paying $200,000 a year right now, but upon closing, they're going to be leaving. Or even if they wanted to lease it back for 1 year, because they needed maybe 6 months to a year to leave, that building will now be worth a different amount of money, right? Be valued slightly differently than building number 2, which is $200,000 a year, triple net. Which means the net income, the NOI, is $200,000 a year, right? And let's just say those leases, because it's a single tenant lease, let's say that single tenant, for whatever reason, is Prologis, okay? I know Prologis is going to be in a very different, Prologis, the largest logistics company in the world. For whatever reason, they don't own this building. They typically own everything. But I'm just trying to say a very, very, Fortune 500 company, and let's say they signed a 20-year lease. Triple net, very different valuation than the first one, and also a very different valuation than the third building, because they're all generating $200,000 a year in gross income. Let's just say all my taxes, my insurance, my common area maintenance, some utility costs, right? Let's say all that broken down is $80,000. I'm only netting $120,000 a year. That all being said, all of a sudden these buildings they're identical buildings. They all earn $200,000 a year today, but they're all valued very differently. And that's all because of how the lease structure is, right? And what the situation is. So the script book also has a bunch of other questions, but it's very important to be paying attention to what the leases look like. Because let me give you one last example. Let's say you have an industrial building and 2 different buildings this time. Building A, they're all on gross rent, same exact thing, the $200,000 a year in gross rent, okay? But let's say they're all locked in for 5 years with 2% increases a year, okay? Gross rent, 2% increases a year. That's building number 1. Building number 2, same exact building, same exact leases. They're paying $200,000 a year gross income, except the only difference is that they're all month to month. One's locked for 5 years, one's month to month. That's the only difference, okay? All the tenants, 10 different tenants. They're all one scenario. Building A is that they're locked in for the next 5 years, all of them. And building B, Building 2 here, they're all month to month. The one, Building A, is going to be worth a lot less money than Building B. Why?
Building A is the building with the 5-year leases on it.
Correct.
Will be worth less than Building B.
Yes.
Off the bat, I was gonna say building A would actually be worth more, so I'm off.
A bank would obviously value the second building a little bit differently because they don't have leases. I understand that. But I'm saying, as an investor, why would building A be worth less to me than building B?
Well, my thought was that building A would be worth more for the simple fact that you've at least got it's stabilized. So over the next 5 years, you know what you're going to be getting, as opposed to the possibility of having to go out and deal with possibly a higher vacancy percentage.
You could
That's
say
where I'm at.
I respect where you're coming from. So let me rephrase that. Let's say it's like let's say that market rent, because right now building A is market like it's currently rented at $10 a foot. That's what 20,000 feet, $10 at 200 grand a year. That's $10 a foot. Let's say market rent is actually $18 triple net. You see where I'm going with this now?
Yes, yes, yes,
Because the problem
100%.
is that, like, I'll give an example. I respect where you're coming from. Giving you more context here, right? What happens is that you want to look at the leases. If don't get me wrong, if let's say that the building A, if that was market rent, okay, was $10 gross, 100% you are correct. The long-term
Right.
leases would be worth more money. Now, if it wasn't market rent, which is what I'm trying to allude to, right, is that it's
Gotcha.
under rented, right? And these leases, let's just say that market rent is $15 to $18 triple net leases, right? And everyone's on $10 gross rent leases, right? The landlord just didn't care. They just rented it for whatever they could at the time. They didn't want to really, push the buttons. They didn't want to raise rents on people. All of a sudden, you're locked in for 5 freaking years, right?
Right.
For rent on this building at a very low amount of money. When in building B, I can evict everyone tomorrow.
You've got flexibility over there at least.
Correct. And I can renew as many people who would like to renew at the new rent, or they can leave. So that's why understanding the leases and market rent, what market rent looks like, right? Very, very important.
I know when we were going over, I think it was C. John's deal last week. We had mentioned, or it might not have been him. Somebody brought a restaurant to the table, and then one of the things that we were looking at was whether or not we can make a purchase contingent on finding a tenant. Of
Yep.
course,
Yep.
is that a shot that we're always going to shoot? And I mean, we'll always shoot the shot, but is it something that sellers are typically open to?
Yeah, look, when it's lucrative, let's talk about when it's super lucrative. So you have an industrial building built the first example where you have an owner occupant. They want to leave. They don't want to continue occupying. They want to leave the building. Owner
Right.
occupant wants to leave. Now the building's going to be sold vacant. No one wants to buy a vacant building unless the next buyer plans on occupying it. What investors like is a building that is occupied, paying with people paying rent. You can make a deal like that contingent upon us re-leasing up the building, right?
Yeah, makes perfect sense.
And you could also do the same thing for something that has a bunch of month-to-month tenants. We would like to also possibly speak to these, like, once we're in contract, we'd like to be able to speak to the tenants, right? Once you have a non-refundable deposit, once we're moving through, everything's good, we'd like to make sure that we can also speak to the tenants and see who would like to stay at the new rent and who would like to leave. And then we'd also like to be able to try to market those vacant spaces that are going to come up for rent.
Pre-purchase, under contract, but
I mean, look,
the sooner we
everything's
can get going, the
negotiable.
better.
Everything's negotiable until it's not. Because
Perfect.
remember, the best thing, think about it as an investor. Let's all sit in the investor lens. All of us all co-own an investment company together. It'd be a little bit rough to have 25 partners, but let's just say we have 25 partners. Okay, we have this investment company. We're trying to buy a building together. What do like? If we're looking at industrial, because that's what the conversation's about here for a second. If we're looking at an industrial building, what would be like an absolute no-brainer deal?
I mean, typically, I hear you saying anything under $100 a square foot. Typically, with
I'm
the
just saying,
triple.
I don't need to be super specific with like the price per square foot or anything, but like let's just talk like broad statements. What, like, if we just came up with a business plan and say what is our goal for buying property? We want to buy them substantially below market value, and it needs to do what day one?
Cash flow.
Cash flow. So we're buying it substantially below market value, and cash flows day one. Now, obviously, the better it is, the more, like, the better the deal would mean that the property is more and more or less and less below, like, or the substantially below market value, and it cash flows like crazy. Those two things in tandem means that you're probably going to make great money.
Right.
So it's like, think about it, if you want to strategically negotiate a deal like industrial properties, I would like to make sure that obviously we get the best price possible. It's not always about price though, because the other part about it is also how much does it cash flow day one. If you have any vacancies, I'd like to negotiate that I could have those leased up prior to closing. Ideally,
Yeah.
or at least have the ability to market it for lease. Because if think about it like this, guys, if you have a building where let's say 50% of it's occupied and you're getting it for a great price, okay? Getting it for a great price, but then you list it for lease and you don't get a single phone call in 6 months. Is that concerning? So it's like, maybe you missed something. Maybe you're like, I thought this area was a lot higher demand than I thought, right? Or maybe you're asking way too much money for rent, and you're actually trying to get a rental price that actually isn't possible in this market. You got to rerun your numbers. This is why I'm saying sometimes asking these types of questions or strategically negotiating those ways can be incredibly lucrative. Now, I'm not saying every single time they're going to agree to it, because that's something the seller has to agree to, but in some instances they'll be open, in some instances they won't.